This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thank you for your very warm welcome. Who here has ever played the game Snakes and Ladders? Excellent. Oh, there's a few hands that haven't gone up though, so maybe we should explain the rules. Who would like to tell me how Snakes and Ladders is played? I know, it's exactly what it says on the tin. You have a board with a grid on it, all numbered 1 to 100 to tell you where you need to go. And every time you roll the dice, you move along the number of squares that are on your dice. That's true. There are all sorts of house rules about whether or not you have to throw an exact number. But the snakes and ladders bit is the important bit. You get to climb up the ladders and you slide down the snakes. It's a very good game because it introduces a huge level of chance into the game. Do you know where Snakes and Ladders came from? It's actually a game from India. Dates from the 13th century. So it's a very old game which was actually designed to teach children moral instruction. So the next time you play it, consider yourselves to be morally instructed. If I had a game, I'd put it down here to distract the younger people. Thinking about the game Snakes and Ladders gives us some insights into the culture in which Jesus lived. First century Mediterranean culture operated under the binaries of shame and honour. This basically meant that people's behaviour was shaped by two things: the threat of being publicly shamed and the promise of being publicly honoured. It's probably difficult for us to fully grasp the motivational power of what that would do to one's reputation in the ancient world. To be shamed was a terrible setback. But to be honoured, moved you forward in the eyes of everyone who mattered most. It was a very important thing to be considering whether shame and honour was going to be attached to whatever you did at any particular time. And in today's text, Jesus tells a parable of a wedding party where shame and honour is a big part of the story. In this wedding party and in this dinner that is taking place, all the people are trying to get to the cool table. I'm going to let somebody else chase the children. Now, if there's anything you know about Jesus from your reading of Gospel, you will know that just about all the time, every time you hear a story about Jesus, he's either just come back from dinner, or he's on his way to dinner, or he's having dinner. The guy ate a lot. Today's story is no exception. The other thing you'll know about stories about Jesus is that Jesus loved to upset the generally accepted ways of doing things. If there were conventions or there were social rules or there was an accepted way that things should be done, Jesus was the one who would just turn all that on its head and do things completely differently. So the people who were usually in, Jesus said, "Nah, you're out." And the people who were usually out, Jesus would say, "No, you're in." The people that everybody else would say, "You're blessed," Jesus would say, "No, not quite so much." And the people who were not blessed by anybody else, Jesus would say, "No, God blesses you." You get both of these things in today's story. Jesus having dinner and the accepted social order being turned topsy-turvy. Here's a tip, he says. The next time you're invited to a wedding, don't take the best seat. What are you going to do if somebody more important turns up? Hard to imagine, I know, but it could happen. And when it does, you'll have to walk the long walk of shame from the front table to the back table, way at the other end of the hall, past the kitchen, past the bins, where no one will see you, no one will even know you're there, probably the waiters will even forget about you. Don't let that happen to you. Meals in Jesus' world were very important social ceremonies. Very little was left to chance. And so people would notice where you were eating, what events you attended, with whom you were sitting, whether you had washed your hands beforehand, whether you had washed your feet beforehand, who you were sitting with, what food you were eating, what wine you were served, whether you were at the table where you got served the best wine or the best coffee, or whether you were at the table where you basically got the really rubbishy, watery down stuff that actually nobody else wanted to drink. People paid attention to what was going on with everybody else. So if you thought your social lives here at Mustard Seed were complicated, and I don't know how you organise your seating plan on a Sunday morning, maybe it's completely random, maybe there's something else going on. Think yourselves lucky you're not living in a Mediterranean first century culture. The parable's commentary on ancient meal practices and social stratification makes a couple of really good points. First of all, we should all cultivate and practice humility, if only because it might help us to avoid embarrassment. But the second point is probably just as important. It's remembering that the very standards and practices of discrimination that cause people to be outcast in society, and it happens in our society as well, will be and should be overthrown. Because God's not into that sort of a scoring system. And I think that's really the point here of this story. This parable is not really intended to be a handy piece of social advice that helps you live your best life and helps you avoid embarrassment and social gaffes that, will have the neighbours talking about you and might make you feel a bit embarrassed. It says even more that the whole point of our lives is not about climbing all those right ladders of prestige and power and social acceptance. Maybe you're part of that game, maybe you're not. But in any case, it's irrelevant. You don't need to do it. Hopefully by now, though, as Christians, we should mostly know that. But this parable does say something very important about the whole concept of shaming and honouring. When I first sat down to write this sermon, I started thinking that the binary codes of shaming and honour that Jesus encountered in his world, and many still do encounter in their worlds, in Middle Eastern countries and Asian countries, possibly even African countries, those sorts of shaming and honour codes and ways of living and behaviour are, well, quite foreign to us and quite irrelevant to us. After all, we live in the 21st century in an affluent, wealthy Western country that is quite modern, permissive, non-judgmental, inclusive. Yes? Is that your experience of the world? Maybe yes and maybe no, that's right. So what do we know about shame? What do we need to know, really? We are probably more familiar with feelings of embarrassment and pride. You've all experienced those from time to time, I'm sure. Embarrassment and pride. Those bad feelings and those good feelings that we get when we do something that's either bad or good. We feel embarrassment when we fail at something, or when something goes wrong for us, or we feel pride when we have achieved something, or when something good has happened for us and we know that we look good to other people. We're used to embarrassment and pride. You probably go through embarrassment and pride on a regular basis several times a day as you go throughout your life and you face the the goods and the bads of ordinary living. Shame and honour is more than this. It's deeper than this. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a black and white description, but embarrassment and pride is what we feel when we've done something. But shame and honour is very much attached to who we are. It's not just what we've done, but shame and honour goes to the very core of who we are, our identity, our sense of self, our sense of value and worth and meaning. All those values and meanings that we attach to ourselves that allow us to get up in the morning and function in everyday society. They are very, very powerful emotions. They go to the very core of our being. Shame might possibly have a value in society because the emotions that affect our behaviour work so much better than our intellect does at affecting our behaviour. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but we are more likely to act on emotion than we are on intellect. How many times have you done something that your brain is telling you you should do this or you shouldn't do this, and yet there is something deeper within you that is just propelling you on to do that action, good or bad? Very often that is emotion. It works so much more strongly than intellect. Because of this, and because we have a very human need to feel good and to avoid feelings of, feeling bad about ourselves, shame can be a very powerful motivator. We are motivated by the avoidance of negative emotions. We will do just about anything we can to avoid feeling bad about ourselves. And shame is about the worst that we can feel. In the past, shame has been used by Western culture to control society's norms and behaviours, and that means, of course, individual norms and behaviours. And you can almost see the point of this. In past generations, the threat of shame has curtailed irresponsible behaviour, underage sex, sex outside marriage, inappropriate relationships. But the thing about shame is it is often so arbitrary. And it disproportionately affects those who are already marginalised and those who are already on the wrong side of the power balance. In past generations, we have shamed young girls and women who have found themselves pregnant out of wedlock without apportioning the same level of shame to the fathers who were also part of that circumstance. We see this with reference to the recent debates on abortion law that are going through New South Wales State Parliament. Some groups are very keen to shame women who find themselves in the position of making a very difficult decision, without shaming the government who doesn't help them find affordable housing, or again, shaming the fathers who have contributed to their being in this situation, or allowed for more cost-effective and efficient healthcare for children that are born disabled. In past generations, we have shamed LGBTIQ people for their sexual or gender orientation. Even though we now know that being gay or lesbian or trans is part of your identity, it's not something you can easily choose. And how many people of LGBTIQ orientation have been led to suicide because of this? We still live in a society where people can be shamed on Twitter or other forms of social media or trolled on the internet for the slightest indiscretion and have their entire worlds dismantled. Is there anybody here who listens to podcasts or watch TED Talks, like those sorts of things? I'm seeing some nods, yep. Does anybody here listen to the podcast Chat 10 Looks 3? Yes. It's a bit of a women's thing, it's a bit of a girls' thing. Chat 10 Looks 3 is a podcast, Lee Sales and Annabelle Crabb, the ABC journalists. It's very good. Even if you're not a gal, tune in and listen to it. It is very, very interesting. In their latest episode, they talked about Lee Sales recently meeting Monica Lewinsky, who, of course, is someone who has had her life completely dismantled by shame over something that she did as a 22-year-old, which hardly seems fair. If you're into watching TED Talks, I encourage you to watch her TED Talk, and a TED Talk by a guy called John Ronson, who has written a book on shame. Really, really fascinating and heartbreaking in equal measure. We could talk lots about the ways that people are still shamed in this modern age. It is a very real and traumatic thing. So, what does this parable have to tell us about shame? Well, firstly, I suppose, let's not shame others, because it's not the thing we should be doing as Christians. It's not the way God wants to work. He doesn't work in those sort of binary paradigms. The things that God cares about are not the things that get us all excited and hot under the collar. So let's not do that, and let's not encourage others to do that. And if you have been in a situation where at some point in your life you have been shamed, and you are still dealing with the trauma and consequences of that, find someone to talk to. Find someone pastoral like David, or a counsellor or a psychologist, and talk to them about that. You don't need to live with that burden. But I also think that this parable, quite possibly, gives us a Christian response to shame. It's a response that we have to so many other situations that we might find ourselves in as we deal with the people around us. And that is hospitality. Yes, we should react to those experiencing shaming, including ourselves, with empathy and compassion. But a positive outworking of this is hospitality. It is continuing or beginning to offer loving, radical hospitality and welcome and inclusion, just as I know you do here at Mustard Seed, to those who are outcast by others. All those things that hospitality involves are the very antithesis and an appropriate response to shame. Jesus' words are liberating words that can free us from the necessity of succeeding in our culture's contests of power and status. They free us from those barriers that social order can create so that we are free to create real human community and enjoy all the security and love of God's grace. And they can free us from unnecessary shame. For Jesus, meals were times of celebration and an inclusive fellowship that foreshadowed the inclusiveness of God's kingdom. If somebody would like to push the button to our next slide, this is hospitality. It is the breaking of bread, it is the sharing of communion. It is an open table where anybody is free to come along and participate. No matter who you are, no matter what your background, no matter whether you are one of the people sitting at the front or one of the people sitting at the back. Practicing generosity and inclusiveness in our daily social relationships is the standard that God expects from us. So, who will you be sharing a meal with this week, next Sunday? Who will you be breaking bread with, sharing a coffee with, or a glass of wine, or a glass of beer? You may have plans to spend your meal times with friends and family and colleagues and those people that you like and the people that you are trying to impress. But don't limit yourselves to this. Invite anyone you see or meet, and especially the outcasts. Don't forget to be inclusive. It is probably the best sort of table manners of all. Amen.